Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Dotson, and I'm the founder and program coordinator for Highland Park Poetry, and welcome to Poetry Today. I have with me a guest, Sandra Marchetti, who's a poet. She holds an MFA in creative writing from George Mason University and currently teaches writing at Elmhurst College outside of Chicago. She is the author of Confluence, a debut full-length collection of poetry from Sundress Publications. And I love the names of these things. Eating Dog Press also published an illustrated edition of her essays and poetry called A Detail in the Landscape. And Sandy's first volume, The Canopy, won Midwest Writing Center's Mississippi Valley Chapbook Contest. She won second prize in Prick of the Spindle's 2014 Poetry Open, and her poems and prose appear in South Dakota Review, Blackbird, Southwest Review, The Journal, Subtropics, The Hollands Critic, Sugar House Review, Mid-American Review, Thrush Poetry Journal, Green Mountains Review, and elsewhere. So please welcome Sandy Marchetti.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, well, it's, and it's funny, we've never met.
Yes.
This is the first time
Yes.
we've ever been in the same physical space together.
Yes.
And yet, I have an awareness of you
Right.
through Facebook.
And you too.
Oh, well, I feel like my imprint on Facebook is so teeny weeny, but you post.
Wow.
Well, mostly what I know about you is besides the excitement and enthusiasm about Confluence and the book tour that you've been doing to promote it. I do know that you're a foodie.
Yes.
Because you love to post fabulous photos of whatever gorgeous meal you're enjoying.
I try, yeah.
And I also know that you're a baseball fan because you've also published several baseball sonnets.
Yes, yeah. Baseball poems, summer sonnets. That's the project I'm working on now. So this book, after it was put under contract at Sundress, I said, the book that I really have to write now is this book of Chicago Cubs poems, basically about Wrigley Field and the Cubs and the third generation fandom in my family. So
you're a
that's
native
what it's about. Yes,
of Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, I live in the suburbs too. I live in the western suburbs.
Right.
So, but yeah, so my father and my grandfather lived on the north side of the city for most of their lives, and then my father moved out to Aurora, and I was born in Naperville. But there's a long lineage of Cubs fans there, bleeding hearts, and and my dad and I have been going to we share season tickets with some other people, and we've been going to about 15 games a year for as long as I can remember. So there's a lot of memories there and a lot of pathos and things to write about. So that's what I'm working on now, and it's funny because the poems seem to work on a totally different level than the ones I'm going to read from the book today, because people who don't even like poetry are like, oh, I love those poems. Like, they really strike a chord with me. People are willing to be romantic about baseball, even if they're not willing to be poetry fans, in a larger sense. So.
Okay. So it's more intimidating to say I like poetry than it is to say I like a poem about the Cubs.
Right, right.
Okay.
Because there are even like baseball announcers, like you look at somebody like Vin Scully, who's the announcer for the Dodgers. He's in his 80s, and he recites poems on the air when he's doing games. So there's this idea of, the sport being romantic and knit into our cultural consciousness in a way that, people are willing to kind of wax, sort of poetic for it. I think.
Only poem I know that's I mean, of course, Casey at the Bat is the poem that everybody thinks of when they think of poetry and baseball in the same sentence.
Yeah, Tinker is to Ever is to Chance. There's a poem written about them as well, who were the great double play team for the Cubs. Decades and decades and decades ago. But yeah, there is some sports poetry, even if you think about, like, during March Madness, they play that song at the end, One Shining Moment, and there's just something about sports, I think, especially older men will come up to me and be like, that that was really amazing. After I'm solid about Wrigley Field, so.
Well, I don't want to delay the audience a taste of some of your poetry. So I know you
sure,
don't have
absolutely.
any you don't have any
I
baseball
know.
poems in this book, but
Yeah.
we'll look forward to the next book
Yeah.
and read.
Yes,
read
I would
something.
like to read a few. You know, even though there aren't baseball poems in this book, I have a lot of poems about the natural world, and that seems to be a theme in both of those. I have a fascination with the natural world. So these are sort of connected in that way, where you get a lot of description of outdoors and being sort of melding with architecture and natural space. So I'll read a couple in that vein. Never-ending birds. Soft bulbs of morpho blue, tight light pruned to a circuit. The swallows feather and vector the wind. I plume to watch. Freshed in the ground, they ring the trees as their own sweet planets. Continuous streaks, the green-blue preens take flying lessons. Beam to the ground they are bound by, like no flown thing. They bring around the ground, and bright as floods in winter, flap the wind that takes them, pushes them into its envelope. The swallows, so close, beat. I let them scrim my stance, twist neatly solar. I swallow, lift at my chest where the freckles crack, where the wet wings gleam. Swallows sweep out to swing, my heart up with the hawk who circles the skirmish, weeps and screams. And I'll read one more, which has to do with sort of this natural environment. But this one is an ekphrastic poem, so a poem based on a painting. And this one's kind of a take on Manet's Sur l'Herbe, which we've all seen. It's a very famous painting in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris of these two women who are nude on a riverbank with these two men who are fully clothed, which was really very risky at the time. But so this kind of talks about the male gaze. We've got a little bit of male gaze here. Sur l'Herbe. You miss it, craning away from verdancy. Pause in this place while I glaze you. My head tilts a direction you can't read. Green leaves drape a frame of velvet. Don't move. You can't see. You are a strange portrait. Like Manet, I strain each stroke of cup and nape to show I can. Then muddle you toward the boughs to sway in wilderness already named. One more, or should we?
Sure, go, yeah.
You
can
let
go
me
on.
know.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll have some conversation after
Sure.
the third poem.
Sure, that would be fantastic. So this is a poem I say that I like to read in my Anne Sexton voice. If you've heard Anne Sexton read, she has sort of that low growl. She sort of sounds, she sounds a little menacing, which is perfect for Anne Sexton. So the end of this poem kind of calls upon that. Peninsula. A washed ring of sounds, rocks glazed with boat music. Clouds soot the forests in delicate black salt. A dead fish, bass or bluegill, is half gone back to the rocks and beyond, lies no-eyed on the shoreline. Its extant others, us in canoes and kayaks, merge to the white, straight horizon and wish to reach up. Flexed fingers grab canopy, chill cliffs, a dark-formed maze. I am 7 times the size in climbing, slamming my cheeks into birches, moving north through the dark day.
Wow. Okay. Well, 3 very different poems.
Sure.
Even though there's
Sure.
the connective theme of the being outdoors.
Sure. Yeah.
Was the peninsula inspired by a particular experience in a canoe or a kayak?
Sure. Well, I wasn't in the canoe or kayak, but you're really close. So My husband and I, very typical Midwestern, we like to take trips to Door County. So we were up in Door County. And I was on sort of a cliff overlooking a peninsula area.
Oh, okay.
And so I'm looking at these kayaks going through this little strait. But on the other side of the peninsula, there are these really huge overgrown trees. And I was just imagining, like, what would it be like an Alice in Wonderland moment to, like, climb through them, but be huge and clunky and, I don't know, a little bit magical realism going on there. Somebody who's just not afraid to take territory. There's also a part in Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. It's a chapter called Northing. And she talks about how different species and even people would move north and what northing means in ancient cultures, particularly like snow-based, very cold cultures, and how they would move north and south. And so I was thinking a little bit about that at the time probably too, but yeah.
Well, and then also your whole thing about birds in the first one, I mean, certainly we think of birds going north.
Right.
And, so
yes, north and south for the winter. Yeah, there's a lot in this book about migration and not just the migration of animals or the natural world through the seasons, but also my migration. So a lot of this book was written about the Midwest when I wasn't living there. So I lived in Washington, D.C. area when I was doing my graduate degree, and for 4 years. And I missed the landscape around here. Obviously, I miss my family. And so there are a lot of poems about migrating or moving, feeling sort of out of place, displaced, and just sort of dizzied by different sorts of landscapes. So the Midwestern landscape felt to me like home, that I could see the sky anywhere I was. When I moved to Virginia, the extremely tall trees, there would be a Target store like cut into a forest. And you couldn't see it from the road, and it would just be weird and disorienting to me. So I wrote a lot about how the landscape was affecting me physically, and how I felt being elsewhere.
Well, it's just another point of connection is that I went to the University of Virginia.
Yes.
For my master's.
Yes.
Now, my master's was not in poetry; it was in acting and drama. And I only became a poet much later in life.
Okay.
I creatively took a detour, shall we say?
Yes, that all helps though.
But
yeah.
I do understand what you're talking about, sort of the difference between the geography of the Virginia, Maryland, D.C. areas, not like here.
Right. And I think people who live in hilly regions or even mountainous regions that I know that now live in Illinois feel like they a couple of them have said to me, I feel like I have vertigo, like I can see too much, I feel so small, everything's so flat, so there's just something that does to you psychologically. Okay. And so a lot of this book has to do with horizon lines and being able to see, which is another takeoff of that sort of Annie Dillard concept as well. But yeah, so, and then there's also a lot of love story mixed in, so the next poems I'll read will have to do with that.
That sounds exciting.
Sure.
I guess I like yours. There's an accessibility, but it's not, I don't know. I think of my poems as being very accessible to the reader.
Right, okay.
Whereas yours seem, you're able to take the unexpected twist or turn, connection,
thank you.
metaphor that, that's not
right.
So on the surface, like
sure.
my writing. So this is why I'm very admiring. This is a compliment.
Oh, you're very sweet. I was just telling someone the other day, though, that my favorite poetry to read is like narrative poetry. I love reading narrative poetry. There's something about it that's really satisfying, like reading people like Sherman Alexi's poetry. There's just something about telling that story. Another person, I guess I'm thinking Native American, but Natalie Diaz, her poems are really narrative, but they're stunning and beautiful all at the same time as telling an accessible, understandable story. So that's kind of my I won't say guilty pleasure, because I don't think reading poetry can be considered a guilty pleasure at all, because it's always still work and important and all of that. But I love reading that. But yeah, I try in my poems to kind of allow you to access them different ways. So like you can access them through the surreal, or you could access them through the sound, but I want you to be able to access them through the narrative, because otherwise I feel like you're not experiencing all the pleasure that a poem can afford unless you're kind of having all those points of interest, you know. I think a lot of poems that work just on sound or work just as word puzzles, for me, as the writer, that wouldn't work for me. I feel like I need to give the reader more than just that, you know. So I try to kind of say, okay, well, if I'm going to do something cool with form, or do something cool with rhyme or metrics, that can't be the only.
Yeah.
That can be the only thing. There has to be the story.
Well, now didn't you recently do a workshop for Rhino where was it mapping? You were talking about.
I'm going to do it actually in just a few days. Oh. No, it's okay. This is good advertisement for it. It's on the 26th. Yeah, okay. And it is on sound mapping. So when I was taught to scan poems, like to look at their metrics and figure out how many feet are in a line and what was the pattern, it was really hard for me. I never really learned it correctly. I tried a few times. I had a bunch of classes. But I wanted there to be a sound and rhythm in my poetry. My husband is a musician, and he can read music, and he was really good at finding the music in my poems. Wow. Okay. So he would say, here are some sounds that seem to be repeating. What if you actually took notice of that and tried to make that repetition more regular or whatever? Okay. So that's kind of how it started, but then I created this process, which I don't think is original. I actually think other poets do this, because it's not ingenious or anything, but just to kind of map the sounds of the poem. So if there are S's that are recurring, to circle them on the draft and see how many and where, or if they're, how many times am I ending a line on an adjective, or how many adjectives do I have versus nouns versus verbs, and kind of seeing if I can even that out or unbalance it. Or sometimes I will look for slant rhymes or consonants repeating versus vowels.
Slant rhyme, for people who don't know, is what rhyme?
I like almost rhyme.
Okay.
Like instead of near and dear, it would be near and for, maybe.
Okay.
So something that almost rhymes.
Sound, but
yeah.
it's not
Right. Not a complete rhyme, not an easy rhyme, but something where the sounds kind of chime off each other a little bit, and you can sort of hear a repetition. But anyway, so I started looking for that in my poems, and then I started to read my poems out loud, and if I could sort of tap my foot to them, read them out loud, and memorize them, I knew that then they would scan. And sure enough, then I became able to scan my poems and figure out what their form was and their metrics. But I needed to go about it in this sort of oblong process. And so that's what I'm going to be teaching at the workshop.
Oh, neat. Okay.
Because for a lot of people, metrical poetry is hard, or they don't like it because it seems antiquated. But this is a way to sort of pump some life into your poems, is that sound and that rhythm. And you don't have to think of it as, it's just going to sound staid if I, write it in the traditional sonnet form. It allows you a little more freedom because you can take what's in the poem already and amplify it rather than trying to fit it in a box that.
Well, who said it that it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing?
Right. Yes. I think that was a jazz musician. Yes, absolutely. And they say, there are a lot of studies on this, that rhythm, songs, they give your brain pleasure. They just make your brain, you tap your foot to a song and you start smiling a little bit, and there's just something about music that pleases our brains. And so for me, my main goal in my poetry is, did my poem give you pleasure? So that's a way to do it, is to make it like music. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think we, myself included, would like to hear some love poems.
Sure, let's do it. I've got a few right here at the end of the book. I think maybe more than a few, but we'll pick a few. Okay, this one is called The Washing. And this one I wrote for my husband, so there you go. It's just as plain as could be. Curved like nautilus shells, milk white with golden ribbing, our spines slope to the sink. We bow over the warmed water. I curl toward the basin, as to pray, as to be cleaned. The wash rag fills and falls, water slipping down your hands and mine. You lift it to my face, wring it out, and let the water run against my chin, my neck. Drying my eyes, you dip the cloth back in and take it for yourself. Hold it against your skin, cool and wet, you sigh.
Now that's not a love poem, that's a sexy poem.
I guess it is. I mean, washing your face can be really sexy. Especially if it's dirty. Okay, so I have a couple more. This one's also about domestic themes, being in the house, walk through. I walk through our home in mind to make a cup of coffee. Greeting leaves in the picture window, I seem slow to grind the beans. A crystal dish, the things I love, the rooms gleam white and clean. Our desk is neat, between your bills, my calendar and pen, the floor plan gauzed beyond a screen. Be tidying when I come, dust me off another thing. I bring to you the late romances, the walls suffuse in cream. Our room, your face, the porcelain, light unbuttons the dream. I itch my eyes open to fix on minnows squirting downstream. Okay, and thank you. I appreciate it. The last poem in the book is called One Secret, and it is a sonnet of sorts. And you can sort of hear the traditional sonnet form, but it's sort of fractured in this. So it ends on a loving note, this book. So if you're into happy endings. One secret. So not to miss the moment of you, I stay my gaze, hit play on the slapdash, shrieked recorder of now. The blue table slides from under your pupil and out toward mine. Motions in sign. The language reminds we will know each other's bodies now, know how they will change. Dusk flares the bones groan, so I rub your stomach until you sleep. I knead my breath to yours, as if you were a child. The confluence of rhythms begins. It is only sound and meaning, sound and meaning.
Oh, wow. Very cool.
Thank you.
Right. Well, I was going to ask, since you do teach,
Yeah.
in addition to this mapping technique, do you have other recommendations that you'd give to your students?
Yeah, like in what vein would you say?
I don't know. Like, I mean, certainly, you know, well, or maybe what's a mistake that many novice poets make that you would try to coach them?
I definitely have one
yes.
for that.
Okay.
One thing I do is I do freelance manuscript critiques too, and I do this for my students as well, but I don't always get to teach creative writing. But whenever I do, whenever I am teaching creative writing, one thing I say to students or even published poets, I find, and I'm not exempt from this either, but just the idea of over-explaining. Because readers of poetry are really adept. They're some of the most erudite readers out there, right? These people are looking for a challenge. They're well educated for the most part. And even if they're not, they usually, you know, there's something they find interesting about making the associative leaps that poetry affords, even narrative poetry, you know? And so what I find is that poets are so worried that their meaning, sometimes poets are so worried that their meaning will not be conveyed, that they want to dot their meaning throughout a poem or throughout a manuscript more than is necessary, you know? So it'll be a whole poem. I'll read a whole poem about, you know, how a poet's mother died, and then the last line will be, and my mother died. And you'll just be like, why is that there? The poem is doing that work, like so much better than that line at the end that just says it, you know? And so you'll find that
That's
a lot.
the show don't tell
Yeah,
type of thing.
I guess so. I guess it really is
Okay.
related to that, because I think that that happens a lot with the poetry that I read, where there will just be a poet who just feels, and it's because the poet isn't necessarily at the place yet where they feel they can trust the reader, you know?
Okay.
Or maybe the poet isn't at the place yet where they're okay with letting go and letting the poem mean something else to someone else than them, right?
Yes,
and so they want to
okay.
be very prescriptive. And I find it in the books that I edit too, where there'll be like 2 or 3 epigraphs, and then there'll be a dedication, and then there'll be sections that have, all the sections have names. And you'll just be like, well, you're really teaching me how to read this book. So how can I really get into the book and find an entrance into it? Because you're prescribing my route so dutifully, you know. And so whenever I talk to poets who are trying that hard, I just try to say to them, you've got to trust yourself that the hints you've dropped or the things that you've said are enough, right?
Well, when you were structuring this manuscript, did you not provide, or did you try to, or did you say, you know, or do what I say, not what I do?
Right. Well, the reason why I tell people this is because I've definitely been a victim of it. So when I was first, I took 5 years to put this book together, and maybe even a year or 2 before that, I was writing some of the poems for it. So when I was putting it together as a book, the first thing I did was I just kind of made it, the order was really vague. I mean, it was really associative, where there'd just be, oh, there's a bird in this poem, so let's put a poem with a bird in it as the next poem. There was just no rhyme or reason, really. Then I tried to reorganize it, because I got some feedback that the first version wasn't working. And so I tried to reorganize it with this really heavy-handed narrative in mind. But the poems, like you said earlier, they don't really work that way. But the book, I had this whole idea of plot for it, like it should, these are the characters, this is the plot line, here's the climax. And so I would try to arrange the poems in an order where you would read it as a story. But that really wasn't working, because that wasn't what these poems are about. They aren't poems that create like a novel-like storyline, which is what I was trying to create. So that didn't work. And that's when I realized, how much do I care if my reader finds that plot to be interesting? You know, would it be better if I kind of tried to arrange it so the poems could speak for themselves and work on more of an emotional level than on this logical level? So I met with Harriet Mullen, who won, well, she was a finalist for the National Book Award for this book she wrote, Sleeping with the Dictionary, which is a book of poetry. And she's a really avant-garde sort of poet. I didn't think we would work well together. But she said, why don't you put like the beating heart of the book, the poems that are the most emotional, the poems that have the most, that have the passion, that the things, the juicy things that the reader wants to see, why don't you put those in the middle of the book and have the rest of it just kind of cool? And I never thought about doing it that way, and it seemed so abstract, but that's really what worked for the book, and I have her to thank for it. And after that, publishers began to be interested, because I stopped trying so hard, you know?
Well, that's a very what a marvelous story.
Yeah.
Because you know, at least that your journey was, I mean, you went the whole range from like no structure to too much structure to a more organic, the beating heart.
Definitely.
So anyway, well, thank you so much. We're gonna really look forward to seeing you in September.
Yes, I can't wait.
It's going to be great. And we'll have more opportunity to hear more of your poems.
Absolutely. And I'll read some baseball poems.
Yay, excellent. All right. Well,
yes.
The Fool has never been to Denmark, but lives vicariously through Royalty magazine. His cell phone doesn't regulate anything. He was texting his girlfriend.
That's my favorite. I love that one. I love it. So I want to thank Jennifer Dodson of Highland Park Poetry, and thanks to our producer, Gilda Lesser, for inviting us today and for producing the program. And especially thanks, Karen, for your wonderful work.